The first time I saw him after Chappaquiddick was shortly after he had appeared before the chief of police in Edgartown, Massachusetts. He came to his father's room, drawn, downcast, intimidated. He looked up at me briefly and nodded his head in greeting. Then he walked over to his father's bed and laid his hand on his shoulder. "Dad," he said, "I'm in some trouble. There's been an accident, and you're going to hear all sorts of things about me from now on. Terrible things. But Dad, I want you to know that they are not true. It was an accident. I'm telling you the truth, Dad. It was an accident." Mr. Kennedy reached for his son's hand and held it tightly against his chest. Hello and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription today. Well, today we are finishing up our kind of breeze through the Kennedy case, the intimate memoirs of the head nurse to Joseph P. Kennedy during the last 8 years of his life. This is Mrs. Dallas. Yes, her name was Mrs. Dallas, Rita Dallas. And Joseph Kennedy was the head of the Kennedy clan. He was John F. Kennedy's father, Robert F. Kennedy's father, and Teddy Kennedy's father, along with 6 other children. There was an older brother who had passed away in World War II, and sisters dotted throughout. Well, what we are going to read today is the selection that has to do with the period in the Kennedy's life, and particularly in Joseph Kennedy's life, after Bobby Kennedy's assassination in 1968, and including the summer of 1969 when Chappaquiddick happened. Because if you remember, so last fall we went through the book Chappaquiddick by Leo D'Amour, and we went piece by piece through all the evidence, through the stories that were told, the various police reports and newspaper reporting, and etc. But one of the things that came out was the various trips to Hyannis port, which is where the Kennedys' home was. And so we're going to get a look from the inside of Hyannis port, specifically from Rita Dallas's lips about what that summer was like. Now, I will say, of course, there's like employee-employer discretion that seems to sometimes be employed. So this is not some kind of like gossipy tell-all. But I will say she did imply in the last reading that we did that even though she never heard talk in the Kennedy compound about conspiracy theories and that sort of thing, she didn't call it that, but she said push back against the Warren Commission, that she personally wondered if there were additional questions that were left unanswered. So she does give us her personal opinion sometimes, and she has given us some sometimes intimate looks like a catty comment from Ethel to Jackie or that kind of thing. So she doesn't completely whitewash everything. You know, in any kind of telling, when it's one person's perspective, we have to go off of, are they being catty? Do they have an axe to grind? Are they covering up something? Are they trying to emphasize something that wasn't true? So we have that no matter what, if we're getting a single person's account. But she was a trusted head nurse over Joseph Kennedy, and the principal people knew her by name. Jack, Jackie, Bobby, and of course Joe and Rose. They have all multiple times had private conversations with her where they relied on her to communicate information to Joseph Kennedy or to help them assess how to deal with something. So she was a trusted person in the household, and yet not a family member, still an outside observer. So we're going to read some of chapter 23, and then we're going to get into chapter 25, where there was some insight into the summer of 1969. 2 of the Kennedys had been assassinated, and the loss was felt throughout the country and within the family. The magnificent Kennedy dynasty that Mr. Kennedy had dreamed of, and that had twice electrified the nation with its extraordinary sense of power and surging youthful vision, had been almost completely decimated. But there was still one son left, and everyone looked to Teddy Kennedy to see whether he would try to fill the vacancy left by his brothers. I do want to say that I believe Bobby Kennedy was a full 8 years younger than JFK. And so he already was quite a youthful version with a lot of zeal, but not as much statescraft behind him as his elder brother had had. And then Teddy Kennedy was a very young man. We're talking, I think, early 30s at this point when he's being asked to do this. And I do want to also say, we saw in our reading of Chappaquiddick, he had been babied. He had been undermined. Like whenever he messed something up, he didn't have to take responsibility for it. Other people would clean it up for him. And so even though he was in his 30s by the time Chappaquiddick happened, he was still a big baby. He was not living in the realm of reality like most people by the time they are married with children in their 30s in their career. He was not there. He was like a 32, 33-year-old big baby who had had his messes cleaned up, had his affairs cleaned up, had his financial dealings cleaned up, had his political things fixed for him. He was really highly dependent considering the level of responsibility that he had. So this is not even just a typical situation of, a man trying to take up the mantle of his brothers. This is a completely unreasonable, irresponsible baby of a man being left with this mantle of two assassinated brothers. Almost from the moment of Bobby's death, speculation had it that he was the only possible contender in the election. But anyone who had seen him with his family at that time would have known that seeking high office was simply not possible for Teddy. He realized that he was being sought out only as a sentimental talisman, and despite the building pressures, he was in no state to take on such a responsibility. I mean, ironically, I don't think he could have been president because I don't believe he was 35 yet, and you have to be 35 to be president, so he wasn't even qualified in that regard. It's quite possible that he could have succeeded purely on the basis of the fact that he was a Kennedy, but the whole family had been made painfully aware that the Kennedy charisma seemed to have turned into a curse. They knew that the fever they generated was the primary element in their extraordinary success, but they were equally aware that the same fever had been the root of destruction. They had received universal adulation, but they had also been the target of an all-consuming hatred. They had seen the murder of 2 sons, and they lived with the horrifying whispers of, if he runs, somebody will get him too. I doubt if time can ever erase the gnawing fear that haunts their every move. It was not easy to bury the shattered bodies, and it will never be easy to risk it yet another time. She wrote this, I'll look here, Rita Dallas, and she did have a helper who I guess helped her write it. But she wrote this in 1973. So 10 years after JFK's assassination, 5 years after RFK's assassination, only 4 years after Chappaquiddick. At a time when Teddy was still, in 1973, he would still be running for president for another 8 or 10 years. So he ran well into, I think the final one when they asked him and he declined, and it was the final one was, I believe, 1988. So for another 15 years, actually, after this book was written, there was still speculation that he might run. So she's not wrong to say it that way. There were already violently extreme feelings about Teddy. He was a Kennedy, and that's all most people could see. Very few people knew anything about who Teddy Kennedy really was, and in a way, he did not know himself. Over the years that I had been on the case, I had seen many changes in Teddy Kennedy. When I first came to the family, he was always full of laughter, fun, and high style. Perhaps the major trait that had separated him from his brothers was that they were all Kennedy, whereas Teddy is more a Fitzgerald. His brothers inherited their qualities from their father, but Teddy radiates the qualities of his grandfather, the controversial Honey Fitz. His flamboyance, his hail, and his hearty political mind, his quick wit, his tendency to cut corners, his smile, all are Fitzgerald. Perhaps this is why Mrs. Kennedy adored him above all her other children. Time and again, when she would hear him in the house laughing and singing, she'd say, "Teddy was our surprise baby, and he's brought more joy into our lives than we ever thought possible." If you haven't been around for long, I do her voice that way because that is as near as I can get to what her voice actually sounded like. If you go listen to interviews, she has the highest, squeakiest voice. It's almost like that grandmother on Christmas Vacation, if you've ever seen that, where she talks in a high, squeaky voice. It's almost that bad. There had never been any jealousy in the family over this youngest child. Everyone loved him, perhaps to a fault. Mr. Kennedy was no exception. He doted on his youngest son. No matter what Teddy did, there were no stern looks or reprimands, no impatient frowns. In happier times, Teddy would burst into his father's room, and at the sight of him, Mr. Kennedy's face would light up. "Hi, Dad," he'd laugh. "Having any fun?" Mr. Kennedy would chuckle and wink, and was always amused at his son's energy and impatience. Teddy was always open and spontaneous with his mother. She was never teased or joshed by her other children, but Teddy would often run up behind her, grab her around the waist in a hearty bear hug, and laugh. "How's my girl? Having any fun?" She would chuckle and pat him affectionately. That's what life had been all about, fun, and there was nothing to indicate that it might ever be otherwise for Teddy Kennedy. He had plenty of time to grow up, plenty of time to worry about accepting responsibilities, plenty of time to develop an image, and more than enough time to settle down and become serious. But time ran out on Teddy, and his father couldn't help him. She tells the story of Cardinal Cushing out with Teddy and Mr. Kennedy on a boat. And the cardinal turned to Teddy when the subject of responsibilities came up, and he began almost lecturing Teddy. "Always remember, Teddy, it's not what you gain in life that matters. It's not what you can gain by being a senator that matters. It's what you do as a man is right or wrong. You must learn to ask your heart whether the act you are doing is proper in the sight of man and God. Never listen to people who flatter you, for their loyalty will be as slippery as their tongues. Learn to face your responsibilities, and you will learn to face yourself. That's the important thing to learn, and it's the hardest thing a man can do. Face himself. Don't idle your time by looking at the gray areas of life. Look for whether it's right or wrong and act from there." Well, that's great advice. I wish he had listened. He heard that, but didn't hear it. He didn't actually take it to heart. Now, he would go on to write the book called Compass, or True Compass is the name of his personal autobiography, which is highly ironic, but he didn't seem to ever take this advice. She says Teddy listened attentively, and his father was completely absorbed in studying his reaction to the cardinal's advice. His eyes were riveted to his son's face. Teddy was receiving the same sound direction from the clergy that his father would have given had he not been so completely handicapped by his stroke. So that's why she was there to see it, is because she was caring for the father. She points out the ways that the Kennedys, the older Kennedys, had grown up having sort of a think tank type dinner table where the father would sort of lob a political conversation into the middle of the dinner table, and then various children would talk about it. He would mentally spar with the children, challenging their thoughts, forcing them into heated but productive debates. This is what she was told from Mrs. Kennedy, but Teddy had been too young to participate in these family think tank sessions. This is a good observation. Also, unlike his brothers, he never received the benefit of his father's political guidance. His compulsive determination was not tempered with the discipline of his father's experience. The two older boys had operated on a pattern that was set by Mr. Kennedy. No mistakes were made in their careers. Well, I don't know if you've heard this, but I have heard that there was an early marriage of JFK that was hushed up. And I have read a little bit, enough to notice that there are some articles about it, but not enough to feel 100% confident that it even did happen. I believe it did. It sounds like he kind of had a foolhardy, quick first wedding that was hushed up and later had to be annulled by the church. And so there are some records about it. So that's a little tangent that you might go search out if you're interested in that, because it does seem that there might be a there. So I don't know that there were no mistakes, but no mistakes that were orchestrated by his father, at least. JFK may have gone off in a foolhardy, quick first marriage that was over very quickly and hushed up very quickly. but nothing was made that was a mistake by his father. Teddy, on the other hand, had been practically handed his political start. He has always worn the label of coat-tail politician. The Kennedy image had been created before he stepped into the picture. He didn't have to work as hard as his father and his brothers had worked. It was all there waiting for him. Perhaps this is why Teddy has always generated such extreme reactions. He got his political career because he was a Kennedy, and from the very beginning he was either loved for being a Kennedy or deeply criticized for being a Kennedy. His bitterest critics often said that Massachusetts was bought for him as a political ornament on the Kennedy tree. Fair. A nice toy for Teddy to play with. And in the beginning, Teddy was very playful. He has natural tendencies as a skilled showman and politician. But he had been young, and with his brothers carrying the heavy responsibilities of their offices, he didn't have to take things that seriously. There was always time. Then suddenly, John Kennedy was dead. Life became a shocking reality for Teddy when his brother was assassinated. He was shattered. The killing confused him, frightened him, matured him. Then his own life was drastically affected in a most personal way on that fog-ridden night, when Senator Birch Bay pulled his unconscious and damaged body from the gnarled wreckage of a small chartered plane. Personal pain became a reality, and Ted Kennedy, who had once bounced into a room like an animated cartoon, began carrying himself with a new caution and dignity. Everything had been bigger than life to him until he clung to it by a thin thread. He became much closer to his father after the plane crash, and all during his slow, painful rehabilitation. The president had drawn close to his father because of his own suffering, and I saw the same thing take place with Teddy. That's interesting. Teddy believed it might be upsetting for his father to see him wearing a brace and using a cane, but Mr. Kennedy had other ideas, and after Teddy moved in next door, he took an intense interest in working out in the pool himself. He once more started his exercises. Well, that's interesting. So father and son did it together. Oh, and in fact, I have the Life magazine of this somewhere, so we'll have to read through it sometime. But it says, Teddy was watching, and unassisted, he walked down the ramp and into the water. He linked his arms in Mr. Kennedy's and proceeded to walk the exercise path with him. A photographer was present, and the picture of the two of them in the pool appeared in the next issue of a national magazine. It did. It showed Teddy still with his back brace on down in the pool. There were no pictures of the president with Mr. Kennedy. It was the same with Bobby. Teddy, however, literally thumbed his nose at the controversial association and said to the world, "This is my dad, and I don't give a damn who knows about it." Neither of his other sons would risk the political consequences, but Teddy could not have cared less. Mr. Kennedy knew this and loved him for it. Interesting. So because of the ambassadors, tendencies in thinking during World War II, they each needed to distance themselves from their father, and even his ties to the mafia and things like that, but Teddy didn't care. Teddy had no sooner achieved a level of maturity that would have enabled him to play a significant role in the resurging Kennedy dynasty when Bobby was killed. With his brother's death, Teddy became a man haunted by loneliness and responsibility. Listen to this. She describes Ethel. Ethel was driven by hysterical, almost uncontrollable grief when her husband was killed. She was pregnant at the time, but when she returned to the compound after the funeral, she startled everyone by taking on wild, frenzied tennis matches. This is interesting because I have heard that she constrained herself with an almost like a tight iron grip of Catholic doctrine guiding her thinking, that she almost took on this hallowed joy, like he's with God now, and took it very seriously, and almost had sneered at how Jackie had done it, that she was very, very Catholic, I'll say it that way, in her response. So to hear of her frenzy, it feels like we're getting to see a different stage of her grief here. She seemed never to be alone and was always hunting a tennis partner. She would get opponents out on the court and banter unmercifully. Everyone knew it was best to let her win. She would throw the racket uncontrollably if she lost the set and ridicule her opponents until, for their own peace of mind, they would let her have the next game. As the days wore on, the tennis games became harder and harder. She could not seem to play enough or win enough. She also had a jukebox installed in the garage of her home, and music would blast out day and night. Her records were played so loudly that Mrs. Kennedy would come in, her fingers pressed to her temples, and say, "Please, someone, call Bobby's house and tell them the music is disturbing Mr. Kennedy again." It would stop for a while, then begin as loud as ever. Very interesting. She gives us a few more looks that I think are worth listening to. She says, "She was running all the time, and it was not surprising when she finally took a bad fall on the court, exhausted. Everyone, doctors, nurses, family, friends, had tried to warn her that she had to let up, but she threw back her shoulders and snapped, 'Let's have at it.' Ethel could not sleep. She would toss and turn for hours, weeping. The secretary said one night, 'I couldn't stand it any longer seeing like that. So I blurted out, "If you think Bobby is in heaven, why don't you ask him to help you?" She said Ethel sat up in bed, tears streaming down her cheeks, and cried, "My God, I do. I go to sleep thinking about him." Ethel Kennedy loved her husband. He was her life. With him gone, it was almost as if she had nothing to live for. She had been shy around Mr. Kennedy, and with Bobby gone, she would never come to visit him without some of her children along. Interesting. In the fall, Jacqueline Kennedy broke away from the shadows of her past and started the world by marrying Aristotle Onassis. Many people turned against her because of this, but the Kennedy women, with the exception of Hyannis, attended the wedding. Mr. Kennedy was not disturbed over the marriage, and it did not alter their relationship. That's interesting. Well, I'm going to skip the Onassis part, even though I know we're all interested, because the goal that we have today is to get through to the summer of 1969. So here we are, chapter 25. The summer of 69 began on a low, sorrowing keel. Mr. Kennedy tried hard to keep to his routine, but it grew more and more difficult. In the beginning, he still went to the pool if the weather was good, and he also enjoyed taking his rides. But Mr. Kennedy was far from his usual self. A new warmth and understanding came into bloom between Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy that summer. They would look at each other, and one could see they were drawn close by the many bridges they had crossed together. Their main concern was Teddy, for he seemed to be lonelier and more lost than anyone at the compound. He would spend long hours with his father, but he was restless, and when he would finally pull himself away, he practically ran to Joe Gargan for companionship. Now, Joe Gargan was his cousin, his first cousin. It's Rose's nephew, and he was the informant for the book that we read. He was a key part to Chappaquiddick, so she's leading us into that story. He needed a close confidant, and although Joe offered him a strong friendship, it was not, nor could it have ever been, the same as Teddy had known with his brothers. Joe was always there when Teddy wanted him, and he would do anything or agree to anything that pleased his cousin. Joe was never too tired, never too busy. Having seen how close they were and how much time they spent together that summer, I can understand why Teddy first went to Joe after the car he was driving went off the Dyke Bridge. I do not have any idea what really happened that night at Chappaquiddick, or why Teddy waited so long to report the accident, because almost nothing was said at the compound. The family was so tight-lipped after the body of Mary Jo Kopechne was discovered that none of us knew any more than what was reported by the press. In truth, I cannot bury the haunting issues of Chappaquiddick, for like the rest of the world, I do not know the answers. But in my heart, I cannot feel condemnation for Teddy Kennedy. As I knew him, he could never have deliberately brought bodily harm to another human being. Although the facts seem cold and ruthless, and he himself admits to erratic, emotional behavior, the Teddy Kennedy I knew was a warm, loving, open-hearted man. The first time I saw him after Chappaquiddick was shortly after he had appeared before the chief of police in Edgartown, Massachusetts. He came to his father's room, drawn, downcast, intimidated. He looked up at me briefly and nodded his head in greeting. Then he walked over to his father's bed and laid his hand on his shoulder. "Dad," he said, "I'm in some trouble. There's been an accident, and you're going to hear all sorts of things about me from now on. Terrible things. But Dad, I want you to know that they are not true. It was an accident. I'm telling you the truth, Dad. It was an accident." Mr. Kennedy reached for his son's hand and held it tightly against his chest. "Dad, a girl was drowned. I stopped by at a party Joe was having for some girls from the office. One of them wanted to catch the ferry and get back to the motel on South Beach. I said I'd take her, but I turned off the wrong road and my car went off the bridge into the tidal pond. I got out, Dad, and I tried to save her, but I couldn't. I guess after that I went to pieces. I walked back to Joe's and then we drove back to the bridge. He tried to get her out too, but he couldn't. I must have gone a little crazy, Dad, because I swam across to Edgartown. I left the scene of the accident and things aren't good because of that. But I want you to know that I'm telling you the truth." Mr. Kennedy nodded weakly, patted Teddy's hand, and closed his eyes. Well, this is very interesting because, assuming she's telling the truth, which we don't know, and she might have some reason to cover a little bit or to tweak something if she had affection for him and wanted to kind of help a little bit. But assuming she's telling the truth, then that would actually fit with the theory that he thought he went basically south on the road that the cottage was on, but actually he went north, and when he thought he was turning to the right to go to the ferry, he actually was turning to the right to go to Dyke Bridge, and that's why he wouldn't have been surprised by the dirt road. And so if this is true, this fits way more with he just got lost. Which again, we had heard before that he is not good with directions. So, perhaps that's true. Perhaps we need to edit our thoughts about Chappaquiddick. If this is what he said, and if this is how it was, then it was an accident of misdirections. The next afternoon, Joe Gargan was at the house talking with his sister, and I noticed he was moving his arm rather stiffly. It was especially noticeable, for he was wearing a long-sleeved shirt, something seldom seen around the Cape. When I asked him what was wrong, he raised his brows and said, "Oh, haven't you heard? I scraped it trying to save Mary Jo." We did hear about that in the book. Joe became his own man after Chappaquiddick, and he was the only one who did not seem to be going around in a state of shock, who did not seem horror-stricken over what had happened. If I were to describe his manner, I would say he was suddenly self-assured. Mrs. Kennedy was deeply disturbed, and in her desperation sent out a call for her family to return to the compound. They came from around the globe, and it was not until Teddy was safely closeted with those who loved him that the atmosphere began to seem less full of tension. Mrs. Kennedy never talked to her son in any personal way while they were at the house. Whenever he would come over, he would visit with his father, never mentioning the accident, and then seek out his mother. They would leave the house together and go to the flagpole that stood in the center of the lawn. Whatever she had to say to him or ask him was not for anyone else to hear. She was heartbroken, but she could not risk jeopardizing her son by asking him questions that could be overheard and misinterpreted. Teddy Kennedy, in his grief and confusion, had sought for trust and wisdom, but he had surrounded himself with yes-men for so many years that on that unfortunate July night, there was no one to help him handle the accident in a disciplined, logical manner. After Chappaquiddick, I would see him stumbling around the compound, confused and alone, and I knew that his heart was broken. His hopes were dashed. His trust in human nature was shattered. The family began arriving as soon as Mrs. Kennedy sent out the word. Jean came with her husband, and Steve immediately started organizing the shambles. Remember, he's the fixer. He moved in fast and made logical decisions. Pat arrived hollow-eyed and nervous. Eunice arrived from Paris and came storming into the house, her face set. "Where's Teddy?" she snapped. "Where's my brother?" I told her he was at home, and she did not pause long enough to see her father or greet her mother. She left the house as she had entered it, in angry haste. Mrs. Onassis arrived from Greece and turned her home over to be used as a headquarters for Teddy's advisors, and she lists them here: Robert McNamara, Bert Marshall, Arthur Goldberg, Arthur Schlesinger, Richard Goodwin, Ted Sorensen, and Pete Markham. Robert Clark Jr. and his son Robert Clark were attorneys that came as well. These men, the thinkers, the policymakers, the speechwriters, all convened at the president's house for long hours of loud, argumentative discussion over what to do about Teddy. Through it all, the man in question was never deeply involved. He walked around in a stupor, more alone than I had ever seen him. Well, that fits with what we had heard described by Joey Gargan, that Ted was not a part of the discussions, that he kind of holed himself up in his room, and then she says walked around in a stupor, but that he was not a part of the discussions. A doctor from Hyannis Port called for an examination. The diagnosis was wear your neck brace, but Teddy shook his head, saying, "No, I can't do it. I can't let people think I'd be trying to get their sympathy." I'm sure any doctor would have recommended hospitalization for Teddy, but because he was apparently in deep emotional shock. But the advisors decided not to enter him. Mistakes were made from the beginning, and I was shocked more than ever when I learned he was to make a confessional speech that was to be televised to the citizens of Massachusetts. Even more disturbing was the fact that it was also to be televised nationally. They can't put the man through that kind of emotional ordeal, I thought. But when Mrs. Onassis called me to her house to give her a B12 shot, I knew it was true. The remnants of the Kennedy clan and its advisors were in her living room, prompting Teddy on his speech. He was dull and listless, hardly able to respond or function. Joe Gargan came into the house and did something I had never seen him do before. He walked right into the living room, fixed himself a drink, and stretched out in an easy chair. This was the same man who once stood outside a room until he was invited in and then waited until someone said, "Sit down, Joe." He was now an integral and necessary part of everything. His testimony in court was the only evidence to substantiate Teddy's. He no longer dwelled on the perimeter. Not only was he needed, but his participation was crucial. Interesting. So she says they were all thinking about what the speech needed to say. The speech was to be televised from the Kennedy living room, and Eunice arrived at the house before anyone else. She issued orders that it was to be a private, family affair, and she wanted no one else around. She took the reins to protect her younger brother. "I don't want anyone staring at him," she said. She was right. It was difficult enough for Teddy to give his speech, but to have a staff who had known him all his life looking on would have been unbearable. Eunice was back, radiating power and strength, and her younger brother drew courage from her. I stayed up with Mr. Kennedy, and we did not turn on the television. When Teddy had finished, he came to his father and said, "Dad, I've done the best I can. I'm sorry." After the telecast and all the speechwriters and advisors and lawyers and hangers-on had disappeared, only the family remained. One by one, they too drifted away, until it seemed that only Teddy was left, alone again. We get to the final pages of the book, from which I will read a few selections. She says, "From that point on, Mr. Kennedy failed rapidly, and a pall hung over the compound, for we all knew that it was only a matter of time." His children would call him every night from wherever they were. They would talk to Mrs. Kennedy first, and if he was asleep, they would not wake him. Whenever 2 or 3 days passed that he had missed talking to them, he would sink into a very blue mood and stare blankly into space. I finally mentioned this to Mrs. Kennedy. "I don't think he understands that they're calling," I said, "and it's making him very despondent." She went to him and gently kissed his cheek. "Joe, dear," she said, "I want you to know that the children call you every night, but sometimes you're dozing, so they talk to me then. They want you to get all the rest you can." He nodded wearily. After that, the calls would keep coming in until he was awake. He would listen to their voices and smile happily. Toward late summer, Mr. Kennedy lost his appetite, and I knew he had given up. Over the years, I watched him sometimes force himself to eat, but when he finally stopped, I felt my heart sink. He barely touched his food after Chappaquiddick. We'll stop there. What a difficult reading. What a difficult summer. And what a difficult position to be the nurse in that situation, to know and love Teddy Kennedy, to know and love the family, to be privy to certain information and not others, and then to watch this man who, whatever we think of him, she was charged with his care. And so to have that moment where he stops eating and where she knew he's given up, it's very sad. Well, let me know what you have thought of this book. I hope you enjoyed the Chappaquiddick reading today and the little insights into Ethel and Teddy that we got during this episode. I'll be looking forward to reading your observations in the comments, and we will be back soon to our Palace Papers readings. I think we're going to commingle those with some potential magazine articles, possibly some, if I'm recording this in advance, so if there are any document drops, which at this point when I'm recording it, we are still waiting for any of the JFK, RFK, and MLK files. But if those drop between now and when this episode airs, then we may be having some episodes of catching up on that together and just have some chat style videos. But we have some fun. Also, during this time when you guys have been watching the Kennedy things, I have been reading a new book that I think we are going to do next. So I will be sharing that with you soon. Be on the lookout for that. And I can't wait to be back into a rhythm of reading books with you. I have loved the Kennedy weeks. I hope you have too. And I hope to do this often, but it'll be nice to get back into some rhythm and routine with a regular book together. I hope you have a great day. Take care. Bye.